This is the DRF Players Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Thursday, August 23rd edition of the DRF Players Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornital, back with you, not with the usual crew, but with a very special guest who we'll get to in a minute. Joining me, as almost always, from the DRF offices in New York City, we have Mike Hogan. How are you today, Mike?
Doing well, Pete. How are you?
Life is good. Dark day in Saratoga. The weather has been as good as it could be the last 2 days. Let's hope that's some foreshadowing for our last 2 weeks of the meet. A place where the weather really is almost always perfect is where our guest today is joining us from. You certainly know him. You know him from the fine work he does in the Daily Racing Form, the great broadcasting he does on NBC and elsewhere. He is Daily Racing Form's own Jay Privman. Jay, how are you doing today?
Good. Good to be with you, Pete and Mike.
It's not that often that we get a professional broadcaster involved with the podcast. Certainly never on the hosting end. But it's really been something we've been meaning to do for a while, and we really appreciate you carving out the time today, Jay.
Yeah, no, happy to do it.
And Jay, this is the first time on the podcast. One of the things we like to do with people when they're on for the first time is just give a little background. Obviously, most listeners will be familiar with you as a DRF employee, and as Pete said, on the NBC broadcast. But why don't you go back even a little further? Just talk a little bit about how you got interested in horse racing in the first place, and how you got your start in the business.
Sure. So, Mike, I grew up in Southern California, and I've lived here my whole life. I grew up in the Los Angeles area. And when I was in my early sports interest days, 8, 9, 10 years old, there was no Sunday racing in California. They raced Tuesday through Saturday then. And every Saturday, the feature race of every Saturday's card, which was the biggest race of the week at Santa Anita or Hollywood Park, was on a local broadcast. And it always came on right after the baseball game of the week on a different channel, but the timing was such that that's when it came on. And it just became something I was aware of. My dad was a racing fan. He'd go to the track with his buddies maybe once a month, but I was a big sports fan. But I became sort of interested in the sport just as being aware of it from watching it on TV when I was 8, 9, 10 years old. I remember wanting to watch the Kentucky Derby in 1969, which is the year Majestic Prince beat Arts and Letters. But what really hooked me was we went on a family vacation to Del Mar to San Diego really, in 1971, and we hit the animal trifecta. We went to the zoo, we went to SeaWorld, and we went to Del Mar. And I just absolutely loved it. And from that point forward, looked at the charts every day in the Los Angeles Times and looked at the entries and just really started following the sport as closely as I followed any other sport that I was interested in at that time all through my teens. And the big break I got professionally was when I was going to college at Cal State Northridge and working part-time. They didn't really have anybody assigned to covering the races at that point full-time. And it was the year that Spectacular Bid came to California to start his 4-year-old year in the Malibu Stakes. And the Malibu now is run on opening day, but at that time it was run a couple weeks into the meet in early January. So the first race I ever covered was Spectacular Bid's Malibu at Santa Anita, and I was just a punk kid still in college working part-time at the LA Daily News. But it was my big break, and I was able to sort of parlay that into a full-time job by the time I graduated a couple of years later. And I went to the Kentucky Derby for the first time in 1982 for the paper. And I remember going back to school right after I got back from the Derby to see my journalism advisor at Northridge, who was obviously still the advisor there. And he said, "How does it feel to have attained your life's goal at age 22? And so I did that. That was sort of a longer story that you probably wanted to hear, but I did that for 10 years. Went to work for the late, great Racing Times as the West Coast editor in 1991. That job lasted a little more than a year. I was then a West Coast correspondent for the New York Times, covering all sorts of sports out here. Whenever the Rangers or the Devils or the Islanders would travel to the West Coast, I'd, for instance, cover the hockey games out here in L.A. or Anaheim or San Jose, and even the 3 Western Canadian cities, and did racing as well, all the Breeders' Cups and Derbies and whatnot for the times through those years. And then in the summer of 1998, when Steve Christ and Charlie Hayward formed the group that bought the Racing Form, Steve approached me about being the national correspondent. So I've had that position since October of 98.
Jay, you're well known for your journalistic bona fides. I think you're something like, what is it, a 6-time winner of the Red Smith Award for best coverage of the Kentucky Derby. You also have a lot of prowess as a handicapper, specifically in the area of figure making, and understand what goes into that side of the business. I wanted to ask you, is there ever a part of you that wishes your job was tilted more towards the handicapping type side of things, or is the journalistic stuff just too much in your blood and part of who you are?
Yeah, I do enjoy the writing and the reporting more than the handicapping, but I really do enjoy the handicapping. The thing and that's really when I first started out at the LA Daily News, I did both. I did a grade at handicap, and then it morphed into an analysis on a daily basis. And I enjoyed it at the time, but the daily grind of doing that year round, to me, is something I really admire, the guys who can keep the passion for that all year round, like Mike Welsh or Brad Free out here, for instance. It's hard. It was hard for me to keep doing that on a regular basis. And so while I really enjoy handicapping, there are times of the year when I'm much more into it, like right now when Del Mar's going. I mean, I really do the work and I'm playing on a regular basis. And then there's other times of the year, like in the spring, when I start traveling a lot for all the Derby preps, where I really am not playing as aggressively in California as I am at other times of the year, just because I'm not around and I don't feel like I have an edge because I'm not watching races on a regular basis and not being there on a regular basis. So I do enjoy the writing and the reporting and the broadcasting a little more, but I like them both.
Well, as a writer and reporter, and as somebody who's able to travel all around the country and see those Derby preps in particular, you mentioned Spectacular Bid. You've probably been exposed, I'm sure you've been exposed to a lot of fantastic horses. Before we start talking about what we saw last weekend, why don't you talk about who you'd consider some of the best horses you ever saw in person?
Well, Spectacular Bid would rank right up there. Affirmed, who I saw quite a bit of because he raced in California, not only at 3 a little bit, but as a 4-year-old as well. And then of more recent vintage, or professionally, John Henry was, after Spectacular Bid, was the next really big horse I covered, and he was around for a long time and an incredibly accomplished horse. And then Sunday Silence was a horse that I thought was an incredibly gifted racehorse. And then more recently, horses like Zenyatta and, of course, American Pharoah's Triple Crown last year was something to finally see something like that pulled off was pretty, was something really special to see. And even now, and with California Chrome and Songbird and Beholder running, I just feel like the level of top class runners right now in this country this year and over the last couple of years has really been kind of an exceptional thing. So it's been a lot of fun.
It sure has. Let me ask you about the Pharoah. As somebody who covers that Triple Crown beat, did that mean a lot to you personally to have the opportunity to cover this story that finally happened? You just started after those 2 big ones in the late 70s, and then so many close calls, and then finally we get the Pharoah in there. Curious what that meant to you in terms of your life's work, and also to get your opinion about him as a horse. It seemed like there were many in the media who maintained a cynicism perhaps up to the Breeders' Cup and maybe even a little bit beyond about the horse. Just curious where you rank him in your heart and historically.
Well, the satisfying thing for me professionally was just being able to see that happen after having covered the sport now for more than 3 decades. And it also was satisfying from the standpoint of to show people that, yes, it can be done. You don't need to change the timing of the races in terms of their distances or the spacing between them. You just need an exceptional horse to come along and to show you that it can be done. It should be a difficult achievement. but it's a doable achievement. And it was nice to see a horse show that it can be done after the long drought since affirmed. So, and the other thing that made it a lot of fun for me to cover is that horse is unlike other horses who had been maybe going for the Triple Crown, like Smarty Jones or some of the others of more recent years. This was a horse who not only completed the Triple Crown, but was based in California the whole time. So even when he was preparing for races like the Haskell or the Travers or the Breeders' Cup Classic, he was doing all that training out here in California, and I was seeing him on a daily basis. And that made it a richer experience to just see the progress that he made and to see the way Bob Baffert handled him, especially coming off of that Travers loss, and the way Bob kind of let the horse down, and then built him back up for that peak performance that he had in the Breeders' Cup. To see the way that Baffert practiced his craft to get that horse ready for that performance at Keeneland last fall was really an incredible thing to watch, and something that I wouldn't have had the feel for if it had been taking place with a horse who was based outside of Southern California and who I wasn't seeing on a daily basis.
Yeah, and perhaps you might not have appreciated it as much had it not been such a long gap. Had you as a college student been able to witness another Triple Crown winner, I think part of, and we've talked about this a bit on the podcast, is part of what made it so sweet for us long-term racing fans is that we got close so many times only to have it not happen. And then eventually when it did, it just felt like, yes, you're right. We don't need to change the rules. We don't need to make a rule that you have to compete in all three legs in order to be eligible. So I would imagine that part of your development professionally, like Pete said, starting out right after we had the last Triple Crown winner, and then professionally experiencing nearly every year of those droughts and every one of those missed opportunities and third legs not quite achieved. I would imagine that made it a little bit sweeter for you as well.
It was just, like I said before, it was just really satisfying to show people that it can be done, that it's an achievement that only an outstanding, exceptional horse can do, and it shouldn't happen often. It should be a special achievement, but it was nice to show that it can be done, and maybe it won't happen again for another 30 years, or maybe it'll happen next year. You don't know, but I think one thing that hopefully we've learned over this story arc is that whoever pulls it off is deserving of it. One of the things that would really bother me in some of the previous attempts to win the Triple Crown by the numerous horses who tried between Affirmed and then American Pharoah was this debate over, well, if this horse wins the Triple Crown, is he still a worthy Triple Crown winner? To me, if you win the Triple Crown, you're a worthy Triple Crown winner because you did it. There shouldn't be some sort of other litmus test other than that.
Ipso
it kind of takes care of itself.
There's some very embarrassing video of me standing on a chair screaming at the end of the Belmont last year that speaks to all these points. Jay, the main two things we're going to want to pick your brain about today are Del Mar and Saratoga, and that reminds me of when you and I first met. You probably don't remember this, but it was 10 years ago. You used to do an annual week to Saratoga back in the day when Harvey Pack was hosting the seminars at Ciro's, and I was the guy sitting in the chair at the side of the stage pointing at Harvey when it was time to speak into the camera. I remember during your week, there was an annual, very entertaining clash between you and our friend Andy Serling about the very basic topic of where is better, Saratoga or Del Mar? From where you sit out there today, I'm just going to ask you point blank. What's better, Saratoga or Del Mar?
Well, first off, I do remember meeting you back then very well because I used to love doing those seminars with Harvey. It was always very entertaining, and he would always bust my chops over being the California kid who would come in as only Harvey can, and he, he's just he's always been just such a great person for the sport has been Harvey. But in terms of what's better, I mean, all I can say is we haven't had any races moved off the grass and field scratched down to 3 out here this summer. So there's that. It really depends on what your whole experience is what you're after. I don't think there's a question that the racing at Saratoga is superior to the racing at Del Mar. There's just more barns there. There's more horses shipping in from different locales. And from that standpoint, the racing probably is better. But in terms of the whole overall experience, we've become a far more civilized place out here because we only race 5 days a week instead of making everybody drag through 6-day racing and almost being able to recover on that 1 day off before being ready to go again on Wednesday. We used to do that out here too. We got smart, and everybody's not waving the white flag of surrender by the end of the meet anymore here. It makes for a better paced meet. The weather out here is obviously superior. I think there's a better quality of life being near the ocean and without humidity and thunderstorms and being a half hour away from a major city where you can have world-class restaurants and if you want to see AAA baseball when the Padres play. So it's really the overall experience to me at Del Mar is better. And I tell people, I really think most people who don't appreciate Del Mar have probably not been here. So I like both places a lot. I really enjoy when I come back to Saratoga, but it's a place I like coming for maybe a week or so or a long weekend, whereas if I have to spend a whole meet somewhere, I really prefer being out here. Plus, it's 15 minutes from my house, so that probably has something to do with it as well.
Making me green with envy, Jay, talking about having more than one theoretical off day a week. It's just amazing what you have to try to cram into a Tuesday around here. And I think the point you make, Jay, might segue nicely into something I know Mike wanted to talk about today, involving the preponderance of excellent horses these days who seem to be California-based. Mike, you sent out a tweet earlier this week. Curious for you to repeat it to Jay in case he missed it, and let us know some of the reaction you've gotten to it, and get Jay's take on it.
Well, yeah, I mean, on the podcast for a while, I've been talking about how last year and this year and even the year before with California Chrome, it just has felt like the 3-year-old males in particular have been much better on the West Coast, and as evidenced by West Coast maidens shipping east and either winning graded stakes or certainly hitting the board in the case of Trojan Nation in graded stakes. And when we had 2 West Coast maidens run in Triple Crown races, not to mention the winners being West Coast based. So I started realizing and then thinking, okay, well, California Chrome and then Beholder and Songbird too. I started realizing all of the good dirt horses, at least in recent memory, have been West Coast based. What's your take on that, Jay? I mean, do you think that is that just kind of the way the chips have fallen today, and maybe next year things could change? Because you're right, there are huge barns at Saratoga. There's obviously not just in New York, but in Kentucky, there's some really quality horses, and they're not just turf runners. Why do you think we've seen so many great dirt horses being stabled or at least originating from Southern California?
I do think it's a cyclical thing, but it certainly has been a West Coast dominated phenomenon for several years now. And a lot of it emanates from the Triple Crown races. We've seen California horses have a lot of success. You go back just maybe 4 or 5 years ago with I'll Have Another and Bodemeister. And then you go forward from that with Nyquist and Exaggerator this year, and you've just seen more of the horses that have been coming. And of course, you've got American Pharoah and California Chrome in between those horses as well. So that I think has put much more of a spotlight on the horses that are coming from here. And there's also been the horses in the Derby preps that have shipped all around the country and won races. For instance, Nyquist earlier this year, as an example, went down to the Florida Derby and beat Mohaymen at the time, and that was a race with 2 unbeaten top 2 contenders for the Kentucky Derby at the time. And we've chronicled over the years all the success that Bob Baffert, for instance, has had shipping into Oaklawn to win races like the Rebel and the Arkansas Derby. So that's part of, I think, how the West Coast has gotten as much attention as it has, just because of that run of success. But it has sort of spread out in recent years to other divisions, and you see how well Songbird has done and has traveled and won, and certainly the excellence that we've seen from Beholder over all these seasons now, as you mentioned, is another example of it. So I think for the Triple Crown, I think the weather out here helps. I think it's usually a better place to train consistently in California, and I think that certainly helps the California horses heading into the Triple Crown races. But this is all the kind of thing that could turn on a dime next year, and you get a run of horses for several years that are just better based out of the East Coast. But one of the things that I do think has helped California racing in recent years has been, more often than not, the Breeders' Cup's been out here, and the horses out here can be based out here and point for those races in the fall, and that's why some of them don't even travel in those years, because it's just the better preps are here, and you don't really need to go. We saw that with Zenyatta, for instance. There was really no need for her to travel the years that the Breeders' Cup were here. When she needed to travel, she traveled, and she ran a great race. But I think that's another aspect of why California horses have done well throughout the year, especially the older runners, is the years that the races are based out here. I think it makes for a more consistent schedule for those horses, as opposed to some of them that in other years might have to go out of town for some of the bigger races.
That makes perfect sense. Now, I think we've gone long enough in the interview, my hosting duties. I'm not sure, some might accuse me of burying the lead, that we haven't talked extensively yet about the Pacific Classic, that unbelievable race from Saturday night that TVs across Saratoga were tuned to, and I can only imagine the excitement that was there in the building for it, Jay. I was blown away by obviously what we saw on the racetrack from California Chrome. Did what you see there surprise you, and what were your impressions of the race in general?
It didn't surprise me that he won. What to me was surprising and really almost jaw-dropping was how dominant he was over top-class horses like Beholder and Dortmund and Opportunity. That to me was what made his performance on Saturday perhaps the best of his whole career. He just made those horses look grossly inferior, and they're not. They fired close to, if not at, their best races, and he still humbled them by 5 lengths. It was just a tremendous performance on his part. And he, having seen this horse a lot over the years, to see how much he's developed physically, he's just a much bigger, stronger horse right now than he was when he was going through the Triple Crown a little more than 2 years ago. And it just shows what can happen if a horse is allowed to develop and mature and continue racing. They just get bigger and stronger, and look how much better this horse is right now and how much more consistent he is in terms of the performances that he turns in. So I thought his race was really the best of his career, and he's had a lot of high points.
Yeah, you made a good point, and it's one that I wanted to be sure we talked about, Jay, which is not only did California Chrome run great, but I would say Beholder, Dortmund, and Opportunity all essentially ran their race. It's not like we had subpar efforts from these major contenders, from these Grade 1 winners. They all ran really, really well, which is even a bigger exclamation point, in my opinion, on how well California Chrome ran that race. I mean, I would agree, best race I've seen from him in his career, and that's saying a lot.
Yeah, we have a running joke on the podcast, sort of just the old horse player cynicism after a big performance. Well, who did he beat? And when you look back at this race and see who he beat, it just enters the jaw-dropping zone. And looking at the race from a speed figure perspective, I think just bears it out even more. I mean, here's California Chrome. He matches matches the career best with a 113. You've got Beholder back in second. Her best races are, well, she had that one freak out in the Pacific Classic, but her typical figure, a 101. She was assigned a 106 by the Beyer team. Dortmund typically runs, his last last few races all over 100, gets the 102. And Opportunity, who's been known to pop up with a 105 and typically runs around 100, runs a 101. I don't think there's any way anybody could impugn the form of this race. It's just one that leaves the question, what do we think we're going to see from here? Do we think this is the best of California Chrome, Jay? Or do you think this horse, with how he's changed physically and how he's been trained this year, has the potential to continue to improve and impress us even more?
I don't know how much more he could improve off of that, but one thing that we did see in the race on Saturday was, I don't think he was asked for his best. He seemed to me like he was kind of toying with the field from the quarter pole home. So it looks like there's maybe a little bit more there, but I don't know how much more you would need in order to beat just about anybody around right now. But the one thing that they've done is they've been able to space his races well, and the next possible race for him would be 6 weeks from the Pacific Classic and then another 5 weeks to the Breeders' Cup. So there's certainly plenty of time to recover from whatever effort there would be if he had to put forth a big effort in the Awesome again. And Art Sherman is even toying with the idea of just training him straight into the Breeders' Cup Classic. But I think when push comes to shove, he'll have one more race. I wouldn't think they'd want to go straight into the Classic off an 11-week break unless he had some sort of an unforeseen minor hiccup that prevented him from running in the Awesome again.
And don't forget the bonus that's available. Funny enough, a friend of mine is involved in the insurance company that put up the policy. I forget how much the policy is for, but I believe it's a 7-figure bonus should a horse sweep the Pacific Classic, the Awesome again, which I was about to call the Goodwood. Thanks for jumping in with the correct name, Jay, and the Breeders' Cup Classic. And when he told me that, I couldn't hide the expression, my worry for him for having put up that bonus. So he'll be thrilled to hear they're at least thinking about skipping the race. But I would think that, yeah, unless something went wrong, why not, right? Why not go for all three and then presumably wrap things up with the Pegasus, which I would assume is also, I don't know if they're thinking that far ahead, but I would have to think that's the reason they bought into the race in the first place.
No, they're definitely thinking that far ahead. And yeah, the bonus is $1 million bonus, and it's something that's been done out here in recent years when they've had the Breeders' Cup. In fact, you might remember Shared Belief was going for that $1 million bonus in the Breeders' Cup Classic the year that Byron took a left-hand turn coming out of the gate. He had won the Pacific Classic and the Awesome again leading up to that year's Breeders' Cup Classic. I did broach the subject of that with Art Sherman when he said, well, we might just wait. I saw him Sunday morning. He said, well, we might just wait for the Breeders' Cup Classic. And I said, well, what about the bonus tied to the Awesome again? And he said, I'm not going to let that determine whether he should run in the race or not. It's just whether it's the right prep for him, because the focal point is the Breeders' Cup Classic, which is a $6 million race, and he wants to make sure he's as right as he can be for that. But I still think, as I was saying a minute ago, when push comes to shove, the right thing is probably going to end up being to run in the Awesome again anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would be surprised if we don't see him, like you said, unless there's some sort of minor hiccup that necessitates skipping the race. So Jay, I tweeted out earlier, he's at $13.25 million in earnings. If he wins the Awesome again and wins the Breeders' Cup, he just has to run second in the Pegasus to get to $20 million in earnings. And if he wins all of them, if he runs the table, I think he'll be around $25 million in earnings. That's not bad for a lucky pulpit out of a mare who she won one. She did win the $8,000 maiden claimer, right?
Right, exactly, and a $2,500 stallion. So yeah, no, he's certainly been I like to call him the John Henry who can go to stud.
That's a great line. So what do you do, Jay, if you're in charge of Beholder's career from here? Mike, I think, did you do the math on what would happen for her? What second in the Classic versus winning the distaff, Mike? What's the story there? Yeah,
so the Classic is now a $6 million race. It was $5 million in previous years, and the distaff is a $2 million race. So second in the Classic is 1.2 million, which also just happens to be the exact same winner's share of winning the distaff. So so there you go. I mean, if you even if you're thinking from a monetary standpoint, and you think, well, we can't beat Chrome, but maybe we could run second, you'd get the same amount for winning the distaff.
What would you do, Jay?
Yeah, with them, I mean, they're not really worried with her about trying to pad her bankroll. They just want to put her in whatever race is the most appropriate. I talked to Richard Mandel on Sunday about what he thought he would do now going forward with her, and he said that he wants to run next in the Zenyatta, which is a race that she's won 3 times. So that's the next, and that's a race that's restricted to fillies and mares, and it's the major prep at Santa Anita's fall meet for the Breeders' Cup Distaff. And he said after that, then he would decide. He said at this point in time, he'd probably be more inclined to go in the Distaff, but he said, I'm not closing the door on anything, which I took to mean his code of, let's see if California Chrome's in the Classic or not. So that's where things stand at the moment. But I think they've done a phenomenal job campaigning her. Don't forget, this is now the second year that she's been on the track that they didn't really expect her to. She was going to be sold, and when she couldn't travel, Wayne Hughes said, let's keep her in training, and she had that great year, and they kept her going for another year, and it's just been fun to just watch her continue to perform. And her race the other day, I mean, that was a winning effort. She just happened to finish second because California Chrome was so exceptional, but most years that performance would have resulted in a victory.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And now, she has the choice of facing, presumably if all things go well for everybody, either California Chrome in the Classic or Songbird in the Distaff. And after what we saw on Saturday, I'm not sure one route is necessarily easier than the other. I mean, Songbird now 10 for 10 from a buyer speed figure standpoint, certainly lower than what California Chrome got in winning the Pacific Classic, but at least from a visual standpoint, I don't know how much more impressive Songbird could have been in winning the Alabama.
Well, and also don't forget, Mike, and I'll address the Songbird stuff in a moment. Don't forget the Distaff's also going to have Stellar Wind, who happened to be
true.
Older earlier this meet. So the Distaff is not exactly setting up a cupcake race either.
And won't we possibly see a rematch?
Race.
Won't we see a rematch between those two in the Zenyatta if all things go well?
Yes.
So we've got that as that's the opening act for that the Breeders' Cup. Should be an amazing rematch, and then to get all 3 potentially together would be incredible too.
What strikes me is, B. Wayne Hughes seems like somebody who is a sportsman also, and in some, let's say it was a cupcake distaff field, not which it's not, but let's say it were, maybe that would tilt the inclination towards going against California Chrome again in sort of a sporting gesture. But it doesn't feel to me like there's anything not sporting about taking on Songbird. I mean, it'd be an incredible marquee matchup if it were to come to fruition. Do you think that might factor into the decision making there at all, Jay?
No, I really don't. I mean, Wayne Hughes has always kind of deferred to what Richard Mandela thinks is the best thing for her. I mean, he definitely wants to shoot for a bigger prize when appropriate, but if they think that the Classic is just a bridge too far for her, they'll run in the Distaff. It's really just to be determined. I mean, don't forget, they were very eager last year to run in the Classic against American Pharoah, so they certainly wouldn't back down from a challenge. It was just 2 days before the race. That lung infection knocked her out of the race. Otherwise, she'd have been in last year's Classic at Keeneland. But fortunately, she stayed in training, and she's had another terrific year. But in terms of what she'll end up doing on Breeders' Cup Day, there's a lot to be determined between now and then, and much of it, I'm sure, will be predicated on how she runs in the Zenyatta.
Let's talk a bit more about Songbird. Buyer speed figure came back for the Alabama 95. Perhaps not. Perhaps 10 furlongs not where she's the best, and she was still just that much better. But I mean, the idea of her at 9 furlongs, how good How good do you expect her to be going forward after these, finally we see one where she doesn't win under a hammerlock, but still wins pretty impressively?
Well, I do think going out to a mile and a quarter was probably a little bit beyond her preferred range, and yet she still won. Her best performance, I think, this year was the race against Karina Mia in the Coaching Club American Oaks, when you saw maybe the second best 3-year-old filly in the country take her on and then just sort of be haughtily dismissed at the top of the stretch. That to me shows just how much better Songbird is than the rest of her generation. What's going to make it really interesting is to see her go up against her elders this fall. At this point in time, her next scheduled race is going to be the Cotillion at Parks, which is also against 3-year-old fillies. And then she'll go up against older mares in the Breeders' Cup Distaff. The Cotillion's at a mile and a 16th. The Distaff is at a mile and an eighth. And I think the distances of those races are a little bit more in her comfort level. But the other thing about her is that, don't forget, she's still a 3-year-old who's getting bigger and stronger. And the Songbird that we saw in July and August at Saratoga will probably be, with continued development, a bigger, stronger Songbird 2 months from now.
Boy, and that's scary, isn't it?
If you have a 3-year-old filly, especially, it certainly is.
All right. Well, I also wanted to talk about the Travers this weekend. They're doing the draw here very shortly. It looks like we're going to have a pretty full field. Obviously, you've followed a lot of these colts and geldings on the Triple Crown Trail. We've got some new horses taking a stab at it, but we've got some old friends in here too, as well as a couple Bob Baffert shippers coming in from the West Coast. What's your take on this field, and do you have any thoughts on how this Travers is shaping up?
Well, it's certainly going to be a fun race. With Dave Grenning, our colleague, earlier this morning reported that they expect a full field of 14 for the race. So it's going to be a terrific race to watch and a terrific race to gamble on. Exaggerator certainly is going to be the marquee name, being a Preakness winner and with that big win in the Haskell. And to me, the fun thing to see this week, assuming the weather stays well, is how he'll do on a dry track. I think that the reason that he's had success is more because he wants a fast pace to run into, as opposed to there being an off track. And I want to see that theory tested this week. I'm hoping that the Travers is run on a dry track with a legitimate fast pace, and then we'll find out if it indeed is pace or sloppy track that makes Exaggerator run to the best of his capabilities. You've got several other horses that have been based back at Saratoga or have run at in the Haskell, like Gunrunner or Creator, both of whom I think ran below par last time, and you'd look for them to try and bounce back with better efforts. And then among others, as you mentioned, the two horses that Baffert is sending back from here, American Freedom, who ran a good race in the Haskell and finishing second, and he's continued to train well since. And then the lightly raced Arrogate, who is a horse who I think has a lot of upside, and I'm looking forward to seeing how well he runs back there. And he was a horse that they had looked at for the Pacific Classic if California Chrome had some sort of a hiccup. They were ready to drop Arrogate into that race. That's how much they think of him, that they put him in against older horses other than California Chrome. So they do think very highly of him, and I think he'll run well as well. And Mike Smith will ride him, and Rafael Bejarano is going to ride American Freedom. And they're both, I think, going to give good accounts of themselves.
I'm going to give a quick run through the probable field for podcast listeners. Exaggerator, top of the market. American Freedom and Connect right in behind. Gunrunner and Gift Box also, and Destin all would project to be probably under about 10 to 1. You've got Arrogate in there, Governor Malibu, Creator, Lauban, the Dandy winner, My Man Sam, Forever Doro, Mahesto, and Anax Imandros looking to round out the field. You'll be able to purchase your Travers PPs in just a little bit on drf.com after the draw. Sometimes on the show, Jay, we play this game where we look at bookmaker prices from overseas and do a little bit of a buy or sell. Obviously, nobody's had time to handicap the race, but I'm just going to throw a number out to both you and Mike and see what you think for Exaggerator. Jay, would you be inclined to buy or sell at around 5-2 on Exaggerator?
At 5-2, I would sell. That's too low in a 14-horse field for me.
Mike Hogan, do you agree, or are you going to rally to Exaggerator's defense here?
No, I would agree. I would want a little more than that. It's a pretty wide open field, and yeah, there's a lot of ways you can go.
A lot can go wrong, and he does, as many achievements as he's had, he does seem like a horse with something to prove. Perhaps Jay's theory is correct, that it's not so much the wet as the paces, the big field, and the confirmed front runner, who just got away with theft, probably are going to contribute to him getting the pace he needs. It's going to be a ton of fun over there. So exciting to be here in Saratoga for Travers Week. I'm really looking forward to how it's all going to shake out. How much attention, Jay, do you get to pay to Saratoga when you're out there in Del Mar? Is it something that you look at daily, or just something you pay attention to for the big races? How much can you devote to it?
No, I watch it pretty regularly. That's one of the nice things about being out here. And again, one of the great advantages of Del Mar and why it's so much preferred to Saratoga is because the Saratoga races start at 10 o'clock our time, and you can watch pretty much the whole card, and the last part of the card overlaps with the first part of the card at Del Mar, so I can watch the whole card pretty easily out here and stay on top of everything. I think it's a lot harder to stay on top of the Del Mar races on a daily basis if you're on the East Coast, because it's getting pretty late in the day when the last part of the card is run. So it certainly lends itself out here to being able, if you want to stay on top of the racing at Saratoga. And I try to do that because I think it's just essential.
All right, Jay, before we wrap up today, I wanted to talk briefly about something that happened the other day at Del Mar, and something a little controversial. You wrote a story about it. There was a dead heat in one of the races, and the photo that was released by Del Mar appears to show a little bit of a gap between the two horses that had dead heated. I know you mentioned that Peter Miller, who trained one of the horses, the one that appeared to have actually been the winner based on the photo that was released, he protested and filed a complaint with the racing board. Why don't you give a little bit of background about that? Because I've seen some people discussing it online as well.
So this was the eighth race on Sunday at Del Mar, and Well Measured, trained by Peter Miller, and Navy Him, trained by Richard Baltus, came to the wire. It was kind of a head bob, and it was one of those where you really couldn't tell who had won when they hit the wire. It was really close. And it took a long time for them to put the photo up, and it was ruled a dead heat. And we all just sort of went on with our day. And then after the races were over, an image of the photo finish was circulated. And as you mentioned, there was some people who, when you look at it, you could see where some people would think that there's a gap between, it looks like basically Well Measured's nose is on the wire and not that of Navy Him. And that's what Peter Miller saw, and that's what he and his owners, who include Gary Barber, the well-known movie producer and MGM studio executive, they are owner of Catch a Glimpse, et cetera. They are in the process of launching a formal protest regarding the result. The racing board publicist who I contacted yesterday had not seen the image, but said that a lot of times the photos that are disseminated to the public are sort of the second generation images of what the stewards and the placing judges work off of, and that they use a high def photo with a high def monitor in order to call these photos, and that the resolution and the detail on that is usually superior to what gets sent out. So I haven't seen that photo yet. There is going to be a meeting tomorrow between the stewards, the owners of Well Measured, and I think media members who are interested in attending to look at the high-resolution photo on the high-resolution monitor and see if it looks any different from the second-generation photo that was disseminated that has caused the controversy. I've tried to play it down the middle so far because, to me, at this point in time, it's a news story, and the news is that there was a photo disseminated that the parties of one of the horses believe shows their horse should have been the outright winner. And until it's all adjudicated, that's kind of where I'm going to stay as sort of an impartial but interested reporter, and I want to see where the story takes me tomorrow.
Mike had asked me, Jay, before we went on air about the idea of why not just disseminate all the high-definition photos to the public. And my theory, based on a conversation I had actually many years ago with somebody who worked behind the scenes at Del Mar, is that if you get high D enough and you zoom in enough, there really aren't that many dead heats. You can using modern technology separate them, but to a point where it would probably be deleterious to get too fine a point, and there has to be sort of an accepted resolution, accepted point where you don't zoom in past and you don't do that to declare a winner in every race, because in a low-res photo it'll look like a dead heat. Are you aware of this phenomenon, and do you have any perspective on it? And do you think that might be why the high-res images aren't as easy to find as some horse players would like?
Yeah, I can't answer to that. I'm not really in the business of speculating. I prefer to just report what is known, and I'll stick with that for now until I know better. I mean, that's some of what you said sounds plausible, but I don't have any firsthand knowledge of that.
I just didn't want people to think there's some conspiracy going on, that they don't want the photos out because there's any funny business going on. It could be the kind of thing where the cure creates more confusion in a way. And I just think horse players, much as I love them, and I do it too, it's always easy to think that there's something going on that's not in their best interest when sometimes I think it can be a little more complicated than that. Mike Hogan, do you accept that explanation, or is this something that concerns you terribly?
Well, I wouldn't say it concerns me terribly, but I think in 21st century, 2016, when you get high-res photos released in other sports and other media, I don't see why there's, they have to schedule a meeting. Why, it's like, look, if they're going to put out a photo at all, why not put out one? It doesn't have to be, like you said, Pete, you don't have to zoom in as far as you possibly could go, but at least release one that could be deemed at a decent resolution to be somewhat high res, rather than as Jay, I can't remember exactly how you described it, but a second or third generation of the high res version. There has to be a happy medium, because it's not just the connections that are concerned, it's also the bettors that have put real money on.
Of course.
Sure.
So folks interested should continue to follow Jay's excellent coverage in drf.com. And also, if you're crazy enough to not already be following Jay Privman on Twitter, you should do that. How can folks find you on there, Jay?
It's DRF Privman. I have my own Twitter account, DRF Privman.
Excellent. So let me ask you another question about the remainder of the Del Mar meet. There's still some highlights to come. Is there anything in particular, Jay, you're looking forward to seeing out there, either in terms of a debut runner or a stakes race or a storyline you've been following for the last couple of weeks of the Del Mar meeting?
Well, the closing weekend is the two grade ones for the 2-year-olds, the debutante on Saturday, September 3rd, and then the futurity on Monday the 5th. And both races, to me, have a lot of interest. The debutante, we've got a number of 2-year-old fillies who look very promising out here, but certainly from a marquee standpoint, none more so than American Cleopatra, American Pharaoh's full sister, and that's where she'll make her next start, is in the Del Mar debutante. So that's a big highlight to come over the last couple weeks of the meet. And then in the Del Mar futurity, you've got Straight Fire and Chasing Aces, who have run the two fastest figs among 2-year-olds in the country this year. Chasing Aces earlier in the meet in a race in which Straight Fire was second, and then Straight Fire came out of that race, to Humble Maidens in his next start, and those two are scheduled to run against one another in the Del Mar Futurity against Klimt, who won the Best Pal last week. So those are, from a 2-year-old standpoint, I think the quality of the 2-year-old racing out here has been very good this summer, and those are going to be the big races at the end of the meet for those respective divisions.
Mike had sent what I thought was a funny tongue-in-cheek tweet about American Cleopatra and the sort of lack of hype that surrounded her debut. I presume, were you as surprised as everybody else at how well she'd run based on what we'd heard from our clocker friends and even some of the folks within the barn?
No, I mean, I had written leading up to the race, including that day on DRF Live, that her recent works had been a big step forward from what she had done when she first came in, and that I expected her to run well. I can't say I thought she'd win, because I thought she was going to take a while to get going and is going to be better with more distance. But for whatever reason, she just fell through the cracks from a betting standpoint. I was shocked she was the price she was. I just figured, just based on her name and her famous sibling, that she was going to be a short price. And for whatever reason, everybody ran in the other direction. To me, there wasn't a question of whether or not she had ability, because she certainly looked like she had ability. It was whether or not 5.5 was going to be a little abrupt for her. But when she broke like she did that day, I was watching the race next to Brad Free, and a quarter of a mile into the race, I turned to him and I said, American Cleopatra's going to kill this deal. Because when she was that close early, I just knew the farther she went, the better she was going to get. So it was a pretty impressive debut.
I can't wait to see what she does next. That's going to be a lot of fun, and it does make you wonder. Sometimes the betting markets in these in 2-year-old races are governed by factors that the handicapper has a lot of trouble discerning. But that's why folks should be paying attention not only to Jay's work in the forum, but also paying attention to DRF Live, where we have correspondents across the country making these kind of observations. And if you're paying attention, it can translate into cashing a few bets as well. Jay, we got a couple more minutes here with you, if you don't mind bearing with us. I want to ask you a non-racing related question next. What's in store for your beloved LA Kings this year?
Boy, it's thanks, BJ. Yeah, really, my heart and my head are heading two different directions. I mean, I'm always a huge fan of them, and I live and die with them. They're the only pro sports team that I'm really a passionate fan of. But logically looking at where they're at and what they've done from a personnel standpoint, I have a feeling the window of glory might be starting to be on the backside here. We've had a great run with a couple of Stanley Cups in recent years, but I really think they might be starting to head down the other side of the mountain. I hope I'm wrong. I'm going to root like I'm wrong, but my head tells me that maybe they're not quite as good as they were a couple of years ago.
Mike, you have any other questions left for Jay?
I don't know. I just, thank you for coming on, Jay. It's been a long time we've been wanting to have you on the show. So I really appreciate you taking the full hour. And, we had a lot of stuff to cover, both past and present. So thank you.
Any final thoughts?
No, it was my pleasure, guys.
Great. Any final thoughts for the listeners, or we'll look forward to seeing you in the Daily Racing Forum?
My final thought would be, if you haven't been to Del Mar, come to Del Mar.
It's the best. I miss it so much. I used to, I've told the story on the show before, but I used to go out there for whichever week Saratoga wasn't running. Now, then, of course, for several years, that week didn't exist because of those schedules, and now it does again, but it's just hard to make it work before being away from home for the 6 weeks to come up here. But I will say this, I'm going to make it out. I'm almost sure I'm going to make it out for the Del Mar fall meet. What's the atmosphere like for the fall meet compared to summer? Am I going to miss the vibe at the old Del Mar, Jay, or am I just going to be so happy to be there that it doesn't make any difference?
Actually, it's both. Those are not mutually exclusive thoughts. The vibe's not quite as frenetic as the summer, but I really enjoy it. It's more of a locals-only kind of feel, and it's only 4-day-a-week racing, Thursday through Sunday, but it's the same great weather, the same great atmosphere, but not, maybe not quite the crowd, certainly, of the summer, but still some important racing. And you've got the fall meet this year, and then, of course, the Breeders' Cup will be held here at Del Mar for the first time in 2017.
Are you optimistic about how they'll be able to pull that off? I mean, after seeing how well Keeneland did, it made me feel a lot better about the prospects of Del Mar doing it.
Yeah, the Breeders' Cup, they come in and take over, and they know how to run these events. I mean, if they could pull off Breeders' Cup at Lone Star Park, which did not have nearly the seating facility of Keeneland or Del Mar, and what they've been able to do in situations like that, and the Keeneland one, as you mentioned, came off as well as you could want. I think things will go very, very well here.
Excellent. And contest players, we got a lot of contest players who listen to this show. There is a big tournament, big live money tournament out at Del Mar in November. I don't have the exact dates in front of me. Chris Barr would be the contact person there. Check it out. Think about if you want to couple your trip to Del Mar with playing in a top-level contest, you can do that too. All right, that's all the time we have for the DRF Players Podcast today. I want to thank Mike Hogan. I want to thank our special guest, Jay Privman. Most of all, I want to thank all of you for listening. We'll be back on Friday with a preview of this weekend's action. Until then, may you win all your photos. 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 All your